What are you doing here?
Hello, my fear seekers. I'm your fear master. There are secrets that should never be uncovered, but curiosity sometimes leads us too far. Tonight, I'll dig up stories where hidden secrets change lives forever. So before you turn off the lights and let the unknown wrap around you, take a moment to drop a comment and share where you're listening from. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. And if you have a chilling story to share, send it to the email in the description. You might just be the next star of our tales. These are tonight's horror stories. A few years ago, my cousin Emily and I, along with her boyfriend Ryan and my brother Matt, decided it would be fun to explore an old abandoned mental hospital. We had heard all kinds of rumors about the place: ghosts, strange noises, the works. It was in a small town in Pennsylvania, hidden deep in the woods, so naturally we couldn't resist. We arrived in the afternoon, parked the car near what used to be the main entrance, and made our way inside. The place was massive, a collection of buildings arranged in a sort of semicircle, all of them connected by underground tunnels. The air felt thick, almost like the walls themselves were holding on to something they didn't want to let go of. A few years ago, my cousin Emily and I, along with her boyfriend Ryan and my brother Matt, decided it would be fun to explore an old abandoned mental hospital. We had heard all kinds of rumors about the place: ghosts, strange noises, the works. It was in a small town in Pennsylvania, hidden deep in the woods, so naturally we couldn't resist. We arrived in the afternoon, parked the car near what used to be the main entrance, and made our way inside. The place was massive, a collection of buildings arranged in a sort of semicircle, all of them connected by underground tunnels. The air felt thick, almost like the walls themselves were holding on to something they didn't want to let go of. That was enough for me. I told them I wanted to wait in the car, and Ryan, sensing my fear, offered to come with me. Matt and Emily decided to keep exploring. Sitting in the car, I felt a little safer, but then the laughter started again. This time it was louder, like it was coming from right outside. I turned the radio up, but it didn't help. The laughter just grew and grew until it was all I could hear. When Matt and Emily finally came back, Emily was pale. She said the laughter hadn't stopped, and that they heard it too, over and over. Ryan tried to shrug it off, saying it was just kids messing around, but I wasn't so sure. That night, after we got home, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the girl in the window, the laughter, and the way the place felt like it was alive. When I finally did fall asleep, I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone was standing over me. But when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. Just the memory of that eerie abandoned hospital, and the haunting feeling that I might never really leave it behind. I've always enjoyed the charm of small, out-of-the-way places. There's something about the quiet, the sense of being away from it all, that appeals to me. So when I found myself on a road trip through New England, I decided to stay at a quaint bed and breakfast I stumbled upon in a small, picturesque town. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been plucked straight out of a postcard white picket fence. Blooming flowers in the garden, and a cozy, welcoming vibe. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, greeted me warmly at the door. She had a kind face, the kind that put you at ease instantly. She showed me to my room, a charming little space on the second floor, with a view of the town's main street. Everything seemed perfect, almost too perfect. That night, after a delicious home-cooked meal, I retired to my room, looking forward to a peaceful night's sleep. But as I settled into bed, I noticed something odd. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the room was holding its breath. I shrugged it off as exhaustion from the long drive and tried to sleep. It wasn't long before the strange noises started. At first it was just a faint creaking, like old wood settling. But then it grew louder footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth outside my door. I sat up, listening intently, but when I opened the door to check, the hallway was empty. The house was silent, as if the sounds had never been there at all. Told myself it was just an old house making old house noises, and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easily. The air seemed to grow colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I could hear faint whispers, almost inaudible, but just enough to send a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers up to my chin, but the sense of unease only grew. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it laughter, soft and eerie, coming from the room next to mine. It was the kind of laughter that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, not from joy, but from something far more sinister. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen in place. The laughter continued, echoing through the walls, and then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I decided to mention the strange noises to Mrs. Thompson. She seemed surprised, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something like fear. She brushed it off quickly, telling me that the house was old and prone to making strange noises, especially at night. But there was something in her tone that made me uneasy, as if she wasn't telling me everything. I spent the day exploring the town, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled over me, but it lingered, a constant weight in the back of my mind. When I returned to the inn that evening, I felt a sense of dread, like I was walking into a trap. But I convinced myself I was being ridiculous. After all, it was just an old house, and old houses made noises. That night, the atmosphere in the house felt even more oppressive. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. As I lay in bed, the whispers started again, this time clearer, like a conversation happening just out of reach. I strained to hear, but the words were just beyond comprehension. Then the laughter returned, louder and more menacing than before. It echoed through the room surrounding me, and I could feel the walls closing in. My pulse raced as I realized that whatever was happening wasn't just my imagination. Something was in the house with me, something that didn't want me there. I decided I had to leave, and I had to leave now. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the door, but when I reached for the doorknob, it was ice cold to the touch. The door wouldn't budge, as if it had been locked from the outside. Panic set in as I pulled and tugged, desperate to escape, but it was no use. The whispers grew louder, closer, and the laughter rang in my ears. Just when I thought I was trapped for good, the door flew open on its own. I didn't waste a second. I bolted down the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste, and ran out into the cold night air. The house loomed behind me, dark and silent, but I could still feel its presence, watching me, urging me to come back inside. I didn't stop running until I was safely in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from that cursed place. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Mrs. Thompson standing in the doorway, her face pale and expressionless. She watched me go, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the window behind her, something dark, something with eyes that glowed faintly in the night. I never looked back. I still don't know what happened in that bed and breakfast, but I've never gone back to that town. The memory of those nights haunts me. The feeling of being watched, the laughter, the whispers. It's all too vivid. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just a ghost or a figment of my imagination. It was something far worse, something that almost claimed me. As a social worker, I've been in plenty of tough situations. My job often takes me to places most people would avoid, run-down neighborhoods, homes in disrepair, and sometimes places where the air itself feels thick with despair. But nothing in my years of experience could have prepared me for what I encountered one cold winter day in rural Montana. I had received a call about an old farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. The place had been abandoned for years, but there were reports of someone living there. A family, maybe, or perhaps squatters. The details were vague, but the concern was real. The town sheriff had asked me to check it out, so I made the long drive through snow-covered fields to see for myself. The farmhouse was easy to spot. It stood alone at the end of a long, winding dirt road, surrounded by nothing but barren land and skeletal trees. The place was a wreck, the roof sagging, windows boarded up or broken, and the paint peeling away in long strips. It looked like something out of a ghost story, the kind of place that time had forgotten. I parked my car and approached the front door, my breath visible in the cold air. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, and when I knocked on the door, it swung open on its own, revealing a dark, musty interior. The smell hit me first, dampness, rot, and something else, something foul that made my stomach turn. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no answer. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The house was eerily silent, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath my feet. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust. It was clear that no one had lived here for a long time. As I moved through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows seemed to shift and dance in the corners of my vision, and every so often, I thought I heard a faint rustling, like something moving just out of sight. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps a stray animal that had found its way inside. But then I reached the kitchen, and that's when I saw it. The room was a mess, pots and pans strewn about, the table overturned, and the floor covered in old, dried blood. But what caught my attention, what made my heart skip a beat, was the large trapdoor in the center of the floor, slightly ajar. A cold draft blew up from below, carrying with it that same foul odor I had smelled when I first entered the house. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there and call the sheriff. but something compelled me to take a closer look. I approached the trap door, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and pulled it open the rest of the way. The stench was overwhelming, and I gagged as I shone my light down into the darkness. The beam of light revealed a set of wooden stairs leading down into what looked like a basement. But the walls were wrong, too smooth, too clean, as if the space had been carved out recently. And then I saw it, the glint of something metallic. I descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, and when I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, cold room. The walls were lined with chains and hooks, some of them still holding tattered remnants of clothing. And in the center of the room there was a large metal table, stained with blood, and surrounded by tools that looked more like instruments of torture than anything else. I backed away, my mind racing as the horrifying realization set in. This wasn't just an abandoned farmhouse. This was a place where something terrible had happened, where people had suffered, and perhaps even died. I needed to get out, to report this to the authorities. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper coming from somewhere in the darkness. "Help me." My blood ran cold, and I froze, listening. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more desperate. "Please, help me." I spun around, shining my flashlight into every corner of the room, but there was no one there. The voice seemed to be coming from the very walls themselves, echoing around me like a cruel joke. I didn't wait to hear it a third time. I bolted up the stairs and out of the house, not stopping until I was safely back in my car. I never went back to that farmhouse. I reported what I found, but the sheriff and his deputies didn't find anything in the basement. They chalked it up to my imagination, the result of an overworked mind, and a place steeped in local legends. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. That farmhouse wasn't just abandoned. It was cursed, tainted by the horrors that had taken place within its walls. And whatever evil had lived there was still waiting, still hungry for its next victim. There's something about the open road that's always filled me with a sense of freedom. My wife, Emily, and I often took road trips to escape the pressures of our everyday lives. We loved exploring the back roads, finding hidden gems in remote areas of the country. But our last trip, one that was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, turned into a nightmare that neither of us will ever forget. We had been driving for hours through the vast, empty stretches of the American Southwest. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the desert landscape. We were somewhere in New Mexico, miles from the nearest town, when we noticed a beat-up old pickup truck in the rearview mirror. It had appeared out of nowhere, and it was following us, keeping pace no matter how fast or slow we drove. At first we tried to brush it off, thinking it was just someone heading in the same direction. But as the miles passed and the truck stayed on our tail, the tension in the car grew. Emily glanced over at me, her expression mirroring the unease that was gnawing at my gut. "Do you think he's following us?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't know," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe he's just taking the same route." But deep down, I didn't believe that. Something about the way the truck was sticking so close, its headlights glaring in our mirrors, felt wrong, predatory. We decided to test it. I took a sudden turn onto a dirt road, one that wasn't on our original route, just to see if the truck would follow. It did. The realization hit us both like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just coincidence. Whoever was driving that truck was after us. Panic set in as I pushed the gas pedal to the floor, the car bouncing and skidding over the rough terrain. The truck followed, its engine roaring as it gained on us. Emily was gripping the seat, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, frightened gasps. "We need to find somewhere to hide," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But there was nothing around us, just endless desert and the fading light of day. The road ahead was a blur as I tried to think, tried to come up with some plan to get us out of this. The truck was getting closer, so close that I could see the outline of the driver, a large man wearing a mask, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. Suddenly, the truck rammed into the back of our car, jolting us forward. Emily screamed, and I fought to keep the car on the road. The impact had rattled us both, but there was no time to think about that. The truck hit us again, harder this time, and I knew that if I didn't do something, we wouldn't make it out of this alive. Up ahead, I saw a narrow canyon, an opening in the rocky landscape that looked just wide enough for the car. Without thinking, I swerved toward it, praying that the truck wouldn't be able to follow. We shot into the canyon, the walls closing in on either side, and for a moment, it seemed like we might have lost him. But then I heard it, the roar of the truck's engine echoing off the canyon walls. He was still behind us, barreling through the narrow passage, determined to run us off the road. The canyon was tight, the road barely wide enough to navigate, and I could feel the car scraping against the rock. The truck was too big, too bulky, and I could hear it crashing against the walls as it tried to follow. I pushed the car to its limits, dodging rocks and debris, the sound of metal on stone filling my ears. Then, just as we rounded a sharp bend, I saw it, a boulder, half blocking the path ahead. I swerved around it, barely making it through, but I knew the truck wouldn't be so lucky. I heard the crash before I saw it, the sound of metal crumpling, glass shattering. The truck had slammed into the boulder, its front end smashed, steam hissing from the engine. I didn't stop. I couldn't. I kept driving until the canyon opened up, and we were back on open road, the truck far behind us. Emily was shaking, tears streaming down her face, but we were alive. We had escaped. It took us hours to find the nearest town, and when we did, we went straight to the sheriff's office. We told them everything, but by the time they got to the canyon, the truck was gone. No sign of the driver, no sign that anyone had been there at all. The memory of that night still haunts us both. We don't take road trips anymore, and every time I see a pickup truck in my rearview mirror, my heart skips a beat. I don't know who that man was or why he came after us, but I do know one thing. He wasn't just trying to scare us. He was trying to kill us. It started as a typical day, the kind that fades into the background of memory, unremarkable in every way. I was coming home from work, juggling my bag and a coffee cup, when I noticed the envelope on my doorstep. It was plain, unmarked, just lying there, as if someone had casually dropped it off. I bent down to pick it up, feeling a slight chill run down my spine, though I couldn't quite place why. There was no return address, no name, nothing to indicate who it was from. Just a plain manila envelope, sealed with tape. My curiosity piqued. I opened it right there, expecting maybe a flyer or some misplaced mail. Instead, I found photographs of me. My breath caught in my throat as I flipped through the glossy images. There I was, walking to my car, sitting in a cafe, staring out of my office window. The photos were clear, detailed, taken from different angles, as if the photographer had been moving around me, capturing every moment. A cold sweat broke out on my skin as I realized that these weren't just random snapshots. They were deliberate, invasive. Someone had been following me, watching me, and I hadn't even noticed. The thought made my stomach turn. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me, my hands trembling as I spread the photos out on the kitchen table. There were at least a dozen, all of them taken within the last few days. How had I not seen them? How had I been so oblivious? For a moment I considered calling the police, but then I hesitated. What could I say? That someone had left photos of me at my door. It wasn't illegal to take pictures in public places. But this was different. It felt like a violation, like someone had reached into my life and stolen a piece of my security. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably some kind of prank, but the unease lingered. The feeling of being watched, of not being alone, stayed with me long after I had put the photos away. I double-checked the locks on my door and windows that night, something I hadn't done in years. But the next morning, there was another envelope. This time I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a long time, fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. When I finally did open it, my heart sank. More photos, this time of me sleeping. My bedroom window, partially obscured by curtains, was clearly visible in the background. Someone had been in my yard. Someone had been close enough to take these pictures. Days passed and the envelopes kept coming. Every morning I found another set of photos waiting for me. Some were of me at work, others of me shopping, eating dinner, even talking to friends. But each time they seemed to get closer, more personal, more intrusive. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, wondering who was watching me. I started avoiding places I used to love, too afraid that I'd find myself in the next set of photos. My life began to revolve around the fear of what I might find at my door each morning. Then one night, I heard it, a soft knock at the door, just after midnight. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There was no one there, just the empty street illuminated by the dim glow of a street lamp. But when I opened the door, there it was. Another envelope, this time with a note. The note was simple, written in neat, precise handwriting. "You look lovely tonight." I dropped the note, my hands trembling uncontrollably. This wasn't just someone watching me from afar anymore. They were here, outside my door, close enough to see me, close enough to leave a message. Panic surged through me, and I called the police again. But when they arrived, the street was empty. No sign of anyone, just the note and the envelope. They searched the area, but it was no use. Whoever it was, they were gone. I spent the next few days in a state of constant anxiety, barely sleeping, jumping at every sound. I didn't know what to do, how to make it stop. I considered staying with a friend, but the thought of leaving my home, my sanctuary, only added to my fear. And then, just as suddenly as they started, the envelopes stopped. No more photos, no more notes, nothing. The silence was almost worse. The waiting, the wondering if it was really over. Every morning, I still half expected to find another envelope waiting for me, another intrusion into my life. But it never came. Weeks passed, and slowly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a lingering unease that never quite went away. I never found out who was behind the photos or why they stopped. But the memory of those days, of the feeling of being watched, still haunts me. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The photographs may have stopped, but the fear remains, a constant reminder that someone, somewhere, knows far too much about me. I had been planning this hiking trip for months. The rugged mountains of the Smoky Peaks had always called to me, with their towering cliffs and untouched beauty. I packed my gear, eager to escape the hustle of the city and find solace in nature. The forecast was clear, and I set off early in the morning, hoping to make good progress before the day's heat set in. The first day was everything I had hoped for. The trail was challenging, but the reward was worth it. I set up camp near a small stream, the gentle sound of the water lulling me into a sense of peace. I felt disconnected from the world, and for the first time in a long while, I was truly at ease. The next morning, I woke early, the air crisp and the sky clear. I packed up quickly, eager to see more of the Smoky Peaks. By midday, the clouds had started to gather, but I wasn't worried. The weather in the mountains was unpredictable, but I was confident in my skills. It wasn't long before I stumbled upon a beautiful, secluded waterfall. I decided to take a break, soaking in the tranquility of the scene. As I sat on a rock, eating my lunch, I heard voices in the distance. At first, I thought nothing of it. Other hikers, perhaps. But the voices grew louder, angrier. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly moved closer to investigate. Hidden behind a cluster of bushes, I saw them. A man and a woman, arguing heatedly. Before I could even process what was happening, the man struck her. She screamed, a sound that chilled me to the bone. I froze, my mind racing. I wanted to help, but fear paralyzed me. The woman fought back, but the man was too strong. Just as I was about to step out from my hiding place, he looked up. Our eyes locked. He knew I had seen everything. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sound of his footsteps close behind. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, the thick vegetation making it difficult to navigate. I stumbled, my legs burning with effort, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep going. His shouts were growing fainter, but I didn't dare slow down. I found a small ravine and slid down into it, hoping the steep walls would hide me. I crouched behind a large boulder, trying to calm my ragged breathing. The forest was eerily silent, the only sound my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. Minutes passed like hours. Just when I thought I was safe, I heard the crunch of footsteps above me. He was close, too close. I held my breath, willing him to pass by. He muttered something under his breath, cursing his luck. And then, silence. I stayed hidden until I was sure he was gone. Slowly I climbed out of the ravine, every muscle in my body trembling with fear. I needed to get back to my campsite, but the sun was already beginning to set. I had to hurry. When I finally reached my campsite, I packed up my things as quickly as I could. My hands shook as I shoved everything into my backpack, my eyes darting around, watching for any sign of movement. Every sound made me jump, the fear of being found gnawing at me. With my pack secured, I started down the trail, using my flashlight sparingly to avoid drawing attention. Hours passed as I made my way through the dark forest, exhaustion weighing on me, but I couldn't afford to stop. I had to reach safety. Just as dawn was breaking, I saw the faint outline of a ranger station in the distance. Relief washed over me, giving me the strength to push on. I stumbled towards the building, my body aching, covered in dirt and scratches. I pounded on the door, desperate for help. A ranger opened the door, his eyes widening in shock at the sight of me. I quickly explained what had happened, and he ushered me inside, locking the door behind us. I was safe, for now. Days later, I learned that the man had been caught, but the experience left a scar on my soul, a lingering fear that would take a long time to fade. The Smoky Peaks, once a place of peace and beauty, now held a darker memory. Living in a quiet town in upstate New York, you get used to your neighbor's quirks. But I never expected what would happen when my neighbor, Jake, asked me for a simple favor. Jake was one of those guys who was always trying to become the next big YouTube star. Over the years, I'd seen him do all kinds of crazy stunts, from eating spoonfuls of cinnamon to riding a shopping cart down a steep hill. Honestly, it was more annoying than anything. So when he knocked on my door a few weeks ago and asked if I could grab his mail while he was out of town, I figured, why not? At least I'd get a break from his antics. The first few days were nothing special, just bills and junk mail. But then, one evening, I came home to find a big, beat-up cardboard box sitting on Jake's porch. In bold red letters, it said, "Return to sender." The box was huge and heavy, way heavier than I expected. Dragging it across the street to my garage was a real workout. Since the box was too bulky to bring inside, I decided to leave it in the garage. My car was already outside because the garage door was a pain to open, so it seemed like the easiest solution. But as I was kicking the door to get it open, the box slipped from my hands and hit the ground with a dull thud. I figured whatever was inside was probably broken, but that was Jake's problem, not mine. I pushed the box into a corner of the garage and didn't think much of it until the smell started. At first, it was just a faint, sweet odor, kind of like something had died nearby. I thought maybe it was a dead animal, which wouldn't be unusual out here. But as the days went on, the smell got worse. It was so strong that it started creeping into the house. I couldn't ignore it anymore. When I finally went to check it out, the stench was overpowering. As soon as I opened the garage door, it hit me like a wall. I held my breath and grabbed some scissors to open the box. The bottom of the box was soggy, leaking something disgusting onto the floor. I had to open it to see what was inside. As I cut through the tape and lifted the flaps, the smell got even worse, like nothing I'd ever smelled before. But what I found inside was way beyond anything I could have imagined. It was Jake. His body was still intact, but he was clearly dead. I was in shock. He had somehow managed to mail himself as part of one of his stupid stunts, and it had gone horribly wrong. I called the police immediately. They took me in for questioning, which made sense considering the situation. But it didn't take long for them to realize I had nothing to do with it. Jake had left behind one piece of evidence that cleared me: a camera. The footage showed Jake climbing into the box, laughing and explaining how he was going to mail himself across state lines. His buddy, someone I'd seen around before helping with his stunts, sealed the box and sent him off. Watching the video was unsettling, but there was one thing that really stuck with me. Just after the box tipped over, the same moment Jake broke his neck, I heard a familiar sound in the background. The screech of my garage door opening. Jake's final destination wasn't just some tragic accident. It ended up right here, in my life, and it's something I'll never forget. I've always valued my solitude. That's why I bought a small, secluded cabin in the woods of northern Michigan, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. As a mechanic, I spent my days working on cars, and my evenings enjoying the quiet of the forest, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was the perfect place to unwind, or so I thought. One chilly autumn evening, I was in the middle of a late-night repair job in the garage attached to my cabin. The sun had set an hours ago, and the only light came from the single bulb hanging over my workbench. I was focused on fixing a stubborn engine when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was rare for anyone to come out this far, especially at night. But the knock came again, louder this time. My heart started to race as I wiped my hands on a rag and made my way to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there, just the cold night air and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to my nerves playing tricks on me and went back inside, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off and get back to work, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. That's when I heard the creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, and there they were. 3 figures standing just inside the door, their faces hidden behind eerie, expressionless masks. I froze, my mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? Before I could react, one of them lunged at me. Instinct kicked in, and I grabbed the nearest tool, a heavy wrench, and swung it with all my strength. The intruder stumbled back, but the others advanced, forcing me to retreat into the living room. My heart was pounding as I fought them off, swinging the wrench wildly. The masked figures were relentless, their silence making the whole situation even more terrifying. It felt like they were toying with me, pushing me further into a corner. I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. In a desperate move, I threw the wrench at one of them and bolted for the back door. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. I made it outside, the cold air hitting me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran towards my truck, parked just outside the cabin, hoping to escape. But as I reached for the door handle, something hit me from behind, knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but they were already on me, dragging me back towards the cabin. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline as I struggled, but there were too many of them. Just when I thought it was over, I heard a loud shout from the edge of the woods. A figure emerged from the trees, shining a flashlight into the faces of my attackers. The sudden light blinded them, and they let go of me. I didn't hesitate. I got to my feet and ran towards the stranger who was waving me over. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where the stranger, a local hunter, helped me into his truck. As we sped away, I looked back at the cabin, now just a shadow in the distance. I never went back. The cabin, once my sanctuary, had become a place of nightmares. I've always valued my solitude. That's why I bought a small, secluded cabin in the woods of northern Michigan, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. As a mechanic, I spent my days working on cars, and my evenings enjoying the quiet of the forest, where the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the distant call of an owl. It was the perfect place to unwind, or so I thought. One chilly autumn evening, I was in the middle of a late-night repair job in the garage attached to my cabin. The sun had set an hours ago, and the only light came from the single bulb hanging over my workbench. I was focused on fixing a stubborn engine when I heard it, a faint knock at the front door. At first I thought I was imagining things. It was rare for anyone to come out this far, especially at night. But the knock came again, louder this time. My heart started to race as I wiped my hands on a rag and made my way to the door. When I opened it, there was no one there, just the cold night air and the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I stepped outside, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. I chalked it up to my nerves playing tricks on me and went back inside. But the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I tried to shake it off and get back to work, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. That's when I heard the creak of a floorboard behind me. I spun around, and there they were. 3 figures standing just inside the door, their faces hidden behind eerie, expressionless masks. I froze, my mind racing. Who were they? What did they want? Before I could react, one of them lunged at me. Instinct kicked in, and I grabbed the nearest tool, a heavy wrench, and swung it with all my strength. The intruder stumbled back, but the others advanced, forcing me to retreat into the living room. My heart was pounding as I fought them off, swinging the wrench wildly. The masked figures were relentless, their silence making the whole situation even more terrifying. It felt like they were toying with me, pushing me further into a corner. I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. In a desperate move, I threw the wrench at one of them and bolted for the back door. I could hear them chasing me, their footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. I made it outside, the cold air hitting me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran towards my truck, parked just outside the cabin, hoping to escape. But as I reached for the door handle, something hit me from behind, knocking me to the ground. I scrambled to my feet, but they were already on me, dragging me back towards the cabin. My mind was a blur of fear and adrenaline as I struggled, but there were too many of them. Just when I thought it was over, I heard a loud shout from the edge of the woods. A figure emerged from the trees, shining a flashlight into the faces of my attackers. The sudden light blinded them, and they let go of me. I didn't hesitate. I got to my feet and ran towards the stranger who was waving me over. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, where the stranger, a local hunter, helped me into his truck. As we sped away, I looked back at the cabin, now just a shadow in the distance. I never went back. The cabin, once my sanctuary, had become a place of nightmares. I've spent most of my life at sea. There's something about the open ocean that calls to me. The vastness, the solitude, the feeling of being free from the constraints of the world on land. But as much as I love the sea, it can also be a place of deep, unsettling mystery, where reality and the unknown blur together. One voyage in particular tested the limits of my sanity and made me question everything I thought I knew about the ocean. I was serving as a deckhand on a cargo ship, making a routine trip along the Atlantic coast. We were carrying a shipment from Maine down to Florida, and everything had been going smoothly. The weather was calm, the crew experienced, and the ship in good condition. But as we passed by a remote stretch of the coast, far from any other vessels or signs of life, things began to change. I've spent most of my life at sea. There's something about the open ocean that calls to me. The vastness, the solitude, the feeling of being free from the constraints of the world on land. But as much as I love the sea, it can also be a place of deep, unsettling mystery, where reality and the unknown blur together. One voyage in particular tested the limits of my sanity and made me question everything I thought I knew about the ocean. I was serving as a deckhand on a cargo ship, making a routine trip along the Atlantic coast. We were carrying a shipment from Maine down to Florida, and everything had been going smoothly. The weather was calm, the crew experienced, and the ship in good condition. But as we passed by a remote stretch of the coast, far from any other vessels or signs of life, things began to change. It started with a thick fog that rolled in out of nowhere, blanketing the ship in a dense, impenetrable mist. We slowed our speed, sounding the horn every few minutes as a precaution. But there was an eerie silence that settled over us, as if the world beyond the fog had ceased to exist. I was on the night watch, pacing the deck and keeping an eye on the radar, when I first saw them. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, or maybe the fog playing tricks on my eyes. But then I saw them again, shadowy figures moving across the deck, just at the edge of my vision. They were indistinct, almost translucent, and they seemed to glide rather than walk. I blinked hard, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. Maybe I was just tired. But the figures didn't go away. They seemed to multiply, more and more of them appearing with each passing minute, all moving in the same direction, toward the bow of the ship. I radioed the bridge, asking if anyone else was seeing this, but the response was static, broken by the occasional word or two that I couldn't make out. My heart started to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I wasn't the kind of man who scared easily, but there was something deeply wrong about what I was seeing. I decided to investigate, hoping to find a rational explanation, maybe a group of stowaways or even some kind of optical illusion. I grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the bow, where the figures seemed to be congregating. As I got closer, the air grew colder, and the fog thickened, wrapping around me like a shroud. When I reached the bow, I saw them clearly for the first time. There were dozens of them, ghostly figures in old-fashioned sailor uniforms, their faces pale and expressionless. They stood in rows, facing out toward the sea, as if waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that they weren't solid. They were flickering, like images on an old film reel, and I could see right through them. One of the figures turned to look at me, its eyes hollow and empty. I froze, unable to move, as it started to walk toward me, its movements slow and deliberate. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that place as possible, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. All I could do was stand there, rooted to the spot, as the figure came closer and closer. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the ship's horn blasted, cutting through the fog like a knife. The figures vanished instantly, dissipating into the mist, as if they had never been there at all. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. When I finally made it back to the bridge, I was shaken but determined to tell the captain what I had seen. But when I tried to explain, the words wouldn't come out right. My voice shook, my thoughts jumbled, and all I could manage was a weak explanation about seeing shadows in the fog. The captain gave me a strange look, but he didn't press the issue. Just told me to get some rest. I never spoke of that night to anyone else on the crew. I couldn't bring myself to relive it, to try and make sense of something that defied all logic. But the memory has stayed with me, haunting me in the quiet moments when I'm alone at sea. I don't know what those figures were, ghosts, echoes of the past, or something else entirely. But I do know that they were real as the ship beneath my feet and the ocean that stretched out into the darkness. And I know that whatever they were not meant to be seen by the living. I grew up in a small farming community in the mountains of North Carolina. Our family had been living on that land for generations, and it was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone. The nights were peaceful, filled with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But there was one night I'll never forget, when the animals cried out like never before. I was about 8 years old at the time, spending the summer on my grandparents' farm. My great-grandfather, a man everyone called Papa Joe, had lived there his entire life. He was one of those people who seemed to have a deep connection with the land and the animals. They all responded to him in a way that was almost supernatural. The cows would follow him without hesitation. The chickens were calm in his presence, and even the wild animals seemed to respect him. Papa Joe was old, though, and everyone knew his time was coming. One evening, the family gathered at the farmhouse because he was very ill. The adults were inside, talking in hushed tones, while us kids played outside, trying to keep our minds off what was happening. As the sun began to set, an eerie feeling settled over the farm. The usual noises of the night seemed to fade away, replaced by an unnatural silence. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the animals began to cry out. First the dogs, then the cows, and soon it seemed like every animal on the farm was screaming. It wasn't just noise. It was a piercing, mournful wail that filled the air. I'll never forget the way it sounded. It was like they were all in pain, like they knew something terrible had happened. My cousins and I stood frozen, too scared to move. We could hear the adults rushing outside, their faces pale with fear. My grandmother, tears streaming down her face, whispered, "He's gone." Papa Joe had passed away, and somehow every animal on that farm had sensed it. They cried for him, all at once, as if they were mourning the loss of the one who had cared for them so deeply. The crying went on for what felt like forever. But eventually the animals quieted down, and the night returned to its usual stillness. But things never felt quite the same on the farm after that. It was as if a part of the land's spirit had gone with Papa Joe. Even now, all these years later, I can still hear those cries in my mind. It's something that will stay with me forever. A reminder of the strange and mysterious connection between life, death, and the natural world. Well, if you made it this far without running to turn on all the lights, congratulations. Subscribe and hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss our next round of true scary stories with rain sounds and black screen. See you every Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. EST. And if you've got a horror story that might keep me up at night, send it in. I'll be waiting. This is your Fear Master, signing out.